In the years leading up to the Great War, the world was already dying. The planet's reserves of oil, uranium, and clean water were dwindling. Nations clashed in brutal conflicts over what scraps remained, and the United States, once a symbol of innovation and democracy, became a fortress state consumed by paranoia and control. It was in this environment that Vault-Tec was born, not just as a corporation, but as an idea, a reflection of everything America had become in its final desperate decades. To understand Vault-Tec's experiments and the legacy of its vaults, we must first look at the world that gave rise to it, a society where fear was as valuable a currency as gold, and where survival was commodified into promises that would never be fulfilled. Vault-Tec was not a small operation. It was a corporate giant, woven directly into the fabric of America's military-industrial complex. On paper, it was marketed as a benevolent protector of the people, a company devoted to ensuring that in the event of nuclear war, American citizens could continue to live, thrive, and rebuild. But beneath the polished advertisements and the cheery sales pitches, Vault-Tec was something else entirely, an arm of government power, a mechanism for experiments in human endurance, psychology, and control. Its history is not simply the story of a corporation, it is the story of how the American government weaponized science against its own people, and how an entire nation was convinced to step willingly into cages. The early 21st century was a time of collapse. The resource wars, beginning in the 2050 seconds, drained the world of stability. America fought in annexations and skirmishes abroad while rationing food, fuel, and water at home. Civil unrest boiled over in the streets. To the average citizen, the prospect of nuclear war was not a distant threat. It was a daily reality. Politicians and corporate executives saw opportunity in this fear. If you could offer protection from the apocalypse, there was nothing people wouldn't pay, nothing they wouldn't sacrifice. Vault-Tec entered this climate with the perfect solution. Massive underground shelters that could house entire communities and preserve the American way of life even after the bombs fell. The company's contracts were enormous, funded almost entirely by the federal government. Vault-Tec's engineers worked alongside the U.S. military and the Department of Energy, designing facilities that were more than just bunkers. They were cities beneath the earth, complete with living quarters, cafeterias, hydroponic farms, water recycling systems, and, in some cases, entertainment halls and educational centers. To the public, these vaults represented salvation. In advertisements, the vaults were shown as bright, clean, safe environments, where families could continue life as normal, while the chaos above consumed the world. Commercials played endlessly across American television, showing smiling parents and cheerful children waving as steel blast doors sealed them safely inside. Vault-Tec even commissioned upbeat songs and promotional films that made life underground appear not just safe, but desirable. But this image was always a lie. Only a fraction of the population would ever be admitted into the vaults. Just 122 planned shelters for a nation of hundreds of millions. More importantly, most of those vaults were never meant to function as survival shelters at all. They were test chambers, each designed to study a different aspect of human behavior or biological endurance under extreme conditions. The so-called Vault Experiment program was not a conspiracy whispered among radicals. It was official government policy, sanctioned at the highest levels. The military-industrial state saw in the vaults a chance to study its own citizens, to refine technologies and social systems that might be used in rebuilding the nation after the inevitable war. To appreciate how Vault-Tec became powerful enough to carry out such experiments, one must look at the broader culture of corporate dominance in pre-war America. Companies like Robco, General Atomics, West Tech, and Poseidon Energy had already become so intertwined with government policy that the line between public and private no longer existed. Vault-Tec developed the forced evolutionary virus under government contract. General Atomics filled American homes with Mr. Handy robots and automated service machines. Poseidon Energy controlled vast portions of the nation's dwindling fuel reserves. Robco built the very terminals and processing systems that would control the military's most sensitive technologies. Vault-Tec fit perfectly into this corporate landscape, presenting itself as the guardian of the civilian population while conducting research with military applications. What made Vault-Tec unique was its blend of propaganda and secrecy. Unlike Vault-Tec, which primarily operated in the scientific and military spheres, Vault-Tec targeted the hearts of ordinary Americans. Its campaigns did not dwell on science or technical specifications. They sold hope, family, and continuity. The vaults were advertised as time capsules of Americana, preserving baseball, apple pie, and the nuclear family even in the face of annihilation. The company produced brochures that depicted vault dwellers living lives of cheerful routine, going to work in underground offices, sending children to school, and celebrating holidays beneath fluorescent lights. It was a fiction so powerful that few stopped to ask whether it was possible, or who would be left outside when the doors sealed. At the same time, deep inside its corporate offices and laboratories, Vault-Tec scientists were designing the cruel reality behind the cheerful brochures. The experiments varied in scope, some psychological, others biological, still others sociological. A handful of vaults, known as control vaults, were genuinely designed to preserve human life as promised. But the majority were anything but safe. Some were programmed to never open, their inhabitants condemned to isolation for generations. Others were stocked with intentionally unbalanced social groups to observe conflict. Many contained hidden devices, from drug dispensers to radiation emitters, to test the effects of stress and mutation. These were not accidents or design flaws, they were deliberate choices written into the contracts between Vault-Tec and the federal government. It is tempting to imagine Vault-Tec as a rogue corporation, operating outside the bounds of oversight, but this was not the case. Vault-Tec was empowered, encouraged, and financed by the US, the government itself. Federal authorities saw the vaults not as humanitarian shelters, but as laboratories that would produce data necessary for the post-war rebuilding of society. The obsession with control was absolute. By studying how people behaved when sealed underground, how they adapted to scarcity, or how they responded to authority, the government hoped to refine a blueprint for the society that would emerge after nuclear fire had wiped the slate clean. The tragedy is that ordinary Americans believed in the promise. Families sold everything they owned for the chance at a spot inside a vault, though selection was almost never based on wealth. Admission was controlled by the government, often through a lottery system, which only deepened the sense of fear and competition. Parents raised their children with the idea that one day they might be chosen, that they might be among the lucky few who would survive. Vault-Tec capitalized on this desperation, encouraging citizens to register, to sign contracts, to trust in the company's benevolence. Very few ever realized that the program was never designed to save them all. The corporate culture within Vault-Tec reflected the broader American ethos of the time: efficiency without morality, ambition without restraint. Executives saw themselves not as businessmen, but as stewards of humanity's future, regardless of the cost. Scientists who worked for Vault-Tec often viewed their subjects not as people, but as data points in long-term experiments. The line between patriotism and cruelty blurred completely. To work at Vault-Tec was to participate in the grandest of national projects, one that promised to ensure American dominance even in the ashes of nuclear fire. The human suffering embedded in that promise was simply collateral damage. The seeds of Vault-Tec's influence can be traced back even earlier to the culture of corporate lobbying and political manipulation that defined America in the 21st century. Like its peers in the defense and energy industries, Vault-Tec cultivated deep ties with Congress, the military, and the presidency itself. Government officials rotated seamlessly between public office and corporate boardrooms. Regulations were written to favor contracts. Billions of dollars flowed into the company's accounts, funding both the construction of vaults and the lavish lifestyles of its executives. In a time when the United States was rationing food and fuel to its own citizens, Vault-Tec executives dined in luxury, shielded by the very system of fear they had helped to perpetuate. By the time the Great War arrived on October 23, 2077, Vault-Tec had already sealed its legacy. Dozens of vaults stood ready, their blast doors primed to close as the first nuclear detonations lit the skies. Families who had been selected entered, clutching their children, believing in the promise of safety. For a brief moment, Vault-Tec appeared to have fulfilled its mission, but as the days turned to weeks and the weeks into years, the truth became undeniable. For those inside, life was not salvation. It was experimentation. For those outside, there was no chance at all. Vault-Tec had never been the savior of America. It had always been its executioner. And yet, even in this, Vault-Tec succeeded. The data it collected, the experiments it conducted, the societies it manipulated, all of it shaped the world that emerged from the ashes. The wastelands of America, its mutants, its fractured communities, and its fragile new nations all bear the mark of Vault-Tec's hand. The corporation is long gone, destroyed with the rest of pre-war America, but its influence remains, sealed into every vault, etched into every survivor's story. To speak of the post-war wasteland is to speak of Vault-Tec, for in truth, the world we know today is the world Vault-Tec designed. If Vault-Tec's rise to prominence was born from fear, then its true power was cemented in the great lie that followed. To the American public, the vaults were presented as havens of safety, fortresses built to withstand the fiery storm of nuclear war. This was the promise endlessly repeated in commercials, government announcements, and glossy brochures. When the end came, your family could live on, untouched, deep beneath the earth, waiting until it was safe to return. But the truth was far darker. The vaults were never designed as shelters for the masses. They were laboratories, tools of control, places where ordinary citizens were reduced to variables in vast experiments sanctioned by their own government. To understand the full horror of Vault-Tec, one must explore the gulf between what the people believed and what was really waiting for them behind those steel blast doors. The marketing of the Vault program was as relentless as it was manipulative. Vault-Tec understood that in a time of escalating global tension, fear could be weaponized as easily as any nuclear warhead. The company produced films that portrayed life underground as not just secure, but idyllic. Families sat around dining tables, laughing under warm lights while the world above burned. Children were shown in brightly painted classrooms, their teachers smiling as if nothing had changed. The message was clear. While the surface world was doomed, life inside a vault would be a continuation of everything Americans loved about their country. Even the mascot, Vault Boy, became a cultural icon, an ever-smiling figure who assured the public that no matter how dire things became, Vault-Tec would be there to keep them safe. Yet, as comforting as these images were, they masked a truth that was never disclosed to the public. The federal government had commissioned 122 vaults, a number laughably small for a nation of hundreds of millions. Only a fraction of the population could ever hope to enter, and of those selected, most would not be saved at all. The official purpose of the vaults, buried in classified documents, was not protection, but experimentation. The program's administrators believed that to rebuild the nation after a nuclear exchange, data would be needed on how humans reacted to extreme conditions. Each vault would serve as a controlled environment, testing a different variable. Some were designed to fail almost immediately, others to endure for generations, but nearly all were intended to teach, to measure, to observe. The promise of salvation was, for most, a calculated deception. The extent of the propaganda was staggering. Billboards plastered cities with cheerful slogans urging families to register for selection. Radio advertisements played between news reports of collapsing foreign governments and food riots, promising peace of mind through Vault-Tec. Recruitment offices appeared in towns and cities, where hopeful parents could sign contracts and undergo interviews. Government lotteries were staged, with winners announced in dramatic public events, further reinforcing the illusion that entry into a vault was both fair and patriotic. What no one realized was that the outcome of many of these lotteries had already been decided. Selection often prioritized individuals or groups that would suit the conditions of a given experiment. Scientists and administrators were more interested in the composition of their test subjects than in saving lives. The great lie of Vault-Tec was reinforced by secrecy at every level. Even within the company, knowledge of the experiments was compartmentalized. Engineers and construction crews who built the vaults often believed they were genuinely building shelters. Marketers and public relations staff certainly thought so. Only the highest-ranking executives and government liaisons knew the truth of the program's sinister design. To the average worker, Vault-Tec was simply a corporation performing a public service. To the average citizen, it was salvation. Only in the shadowy corridors of classified briefings was the reality acknowledged. The vaults were never intended to save humanity. They were designed to dissect it. What made the deception particularly effective was the cultural climate of pre-war America. Trust in government was at an all-time high, not because of transparency or honesty, but because fear of annihilation left little room for skepticism. People wanted to believe. They wanted to think that their leaders had a plan, that someone was working to protect them from the inevitable. Vault-Tec exploited this need with ruthless precision. It became unpatriotic to question the program, almost treasonous. To doubt the vaults was to doubt the future of the nation itself. Citizens who raised concerns were dismissed as alarmists or conspiracy theorists. After all, why wouldn't the government want to protect its people? Why would Vault-Tec, a corporation that had become a household name, spend billions building underground shelters if not to save lives? The reality, however, was hiding in plain sight. The sheer scale of the deception should have raised questions. 122 vaults could not possibly hold more than a tiny percentage of the population, yet the program was advertised as if it were a solution for everyone. Even if every vault held 1,000 people, a generous estimate, the total capacity would not exceed 200,000. For a country of more than 400 million, this meant that less than 0.1% of the population could ever be sheltered. And yet, families across the nation clung to the hope that they would be chosen, that their number would come up when the bombs fell. This was the genius of the lie. It played not on logic, but on desperation. Inside the government, the Vault program was discussed in terms of data and outcomes rather than lives. Memoranda referred to test, groups, and control environments. Proposals outlined experiments in genetic mutation, social hierarchies, resource scarcity, and psychological stress. To the bureaucrats and scientists overseeing the program, the vaults were not homes, but petri dishes. Some vaults were designed to study isolation, remaining sealed indefinitely. Others were supplied with faulty equipment, ensuring breakdowns that would force dwellers into improvisation or conflict. A few were given radical directives, such as Vault-87, which conducted forced exposure to the forced evolutionary virus, or Vault-11, where residents were instructed to sacrifice one of their own each year. These were not errors in design. They were the design. The most chilling aspect of this deception was the way in which it was normalized. Vault-Tec executives did not view themselves as villains. To them, the experiments were necessary sacrifices for the greater good. In their minds, the data gathered from the vaults would allow America to rebuild stronger, more disciplined, and more adaptable. Human suffering was an acceptable cost for national survival. This mentality reflected the broader ethos of pre-war America, a society that had long since abandoned ideals of liberty and equality in favor of control and dominance. In the eyes of Vault-Tec, the people who entered the vaults were not citizens to be protected, but assets to be managed. The lie extended even into the vaults themselves. Many dwellers had no idea their lives were part of an experiment. They followed overseers' instructions, trusting in the authority of the company and the government. For some, it took decades before the truth became clear. For others, it was discovered too late, when the vaults had already claimed countless lives. The cheerful posters on the walls, the smiling mascot on the instruction manuals, the carefully constructed illusion of order, all of it was a mask hiding the machinery of manipulation. The overseer's terminal, often locked away, and accessible only to those with clearance, contained the true directives of the experiment, written in cold, bureaucratic language that revealed just how little Vault-Tec cared for the lives entrusted to its care. Over time, the deception became self-perpetuating. Survivors who eventually emerged from the vaults carried with them stories of betrayal and cruelty, but these tales were often dismissed as exaggerations by those who had never seen the inside of a vault. In the centuries that followed, the vaults took on a kind of mythic status. Some were remembered as cruel prisons, others as miraculous sanctuaries, but always shrouded in mystery. The great lie of Vault-Tec had not only deceived the people of its own time, but had reshaped the collective memory of the wasteland for generations to come. What lingers most about this deception is not just its scale, but its success. Vault-Tec convinced millions to place their trust in a system that was never meant to protect them. It persuaded families to step willingly into confinement, to trade freedom for the illusion of safety. And when the bombs fell, it sealed the doors on countless experiments, ensuring that the legacy of the vaults would be written not in salvation, but in suffering. In this way, Vault-Tec accomplished something no bomb could ever achieve. It killed hope, twisting it into a weapon more insidious than any warhead. It proved that the greatest destruction does not always come from fire and radiation, but from the betrayal of trust, the manipulation of fear, and the deliberate sacrifice of humanity in the name of control. The story of Vault-Tec is not merely a tale of corporate greed or government corruption. It is a story of a people who wanted so desperately to believe in safety that they blinded themselves to the truth. It is the story of a lie so vast that it became reality, shaping not only the fate of those who entered the vaults, but of the entire post-war world. For vaults were not just experiments, they were seeds, planted in the soil of despair, that would one day grow into the fractured wasteland we know today. And, as with all seeds, the harvest was determined from the beginning, sown in deception, nurtured by fear, and reaped in suffering. Vault-Tec's lie was never just about survival, it was about control, and in that, it succeeded beyond measure. If the great lie of Vault-Tec was the promise of safety, then the deeper truth was the philosophy that drove its experiments. Behind every sealed door and every hidden directive lay a belief that human beings could be reshaped, molded, and controlled. The vaults were not built merely to withstand bombs, They were built to test the limits of human endurance, to study the breaking points of societies, and to refine the tools of power that might be wielded in the world to come. At the heart of this philosophy was an obsession with control. Vault-Tec was not content to preserve life. It sought to engineer it, to manipulate the very essence of what it meant to be human. The experiments varied in scale and cruelty, but they all shared a common purpose: to see how far people could be pushed before they bent or broke. For the overseers, the vaults were not homes. They were laboratories, their inhabitants unwitting subjects in studies that would last years, decades, or even generations. This was the science of control, and it was as methodical as it was merciless. In many vaults, the experiments were designed around authority itself. The overseer, armed with a secure terminal and the company's directives, was both governor and warden, judge and executioner. The role was a test of obedience as much as of leadership. Would the overseer follow the cruel instructions handed down by Vault-Tec, or would they rebel, choosing the lives of their people over the demands of the experiment? In some cases, the overseer was given near total power, and their subjects were monitored to see how they responded to tyranny. In others, the overseer's authority was deliberately undermined, replaced by systems that forced the dwellers into endless conflict or paranoia. In both cases, the vault was not a sanctuary, but a crucible. Psychological manipulation was central to many of the experiments. Vault-Tec scientists understood that human beings are social creatures, dependent on trust, communication, and shared purpose. To fracture these bonds was to unravel the very fabric of society. Some vaults were designed with populations too small to sustain themselves, ensuring that over time inbreeding or resource collapse would set in. Others were filled with groups deliberately chosen to be incompatible, forcing them into conflict. Some were subjected to isolation, their doors never meant to open, their inhabitants left to confront the crushing weight of eternity underground. Each scenario was carefully chosen to reveal something about the human condition under stress, something that could be recorded, analyzed, and weaponized. But the science of control went beyond mere psychology. In several vaults, the very environment was designed as an instrument of manipulation. Vault 106, for instance, released psychoactive drugs into the air circulation system, exposing its inhabitants to hallucinations and madness. The experiment was not simply to observe the effects of the drugs, but to study how a society crumbles when its perception of reality is shattered. Vault 11 forced its dwellers into a horrific moral dilemma. Each year, they were required to sacrifice one of their own, told that failure to comply would result in the execution of everyone inside. The vault became a study in coercion, in how fear could compel ordinary people to commit atrocities against their neighbors. Vault 87 turned its population into test subjects for the forced evolutionary virus, creating horrific new supermutants in the name of science. In each case, the experiment was not random. It was a deliberate effort to see how control could be exerted, how obedience could be extracted, and how survival could be twisted into submission. Control extended to information itself. The overseer terminals often contained the true instructions for the vault, but these were hidden from the general population. Dwellers were told only what they needed to know, if they were told anything at all. Many vault residents lived their entire lives without realizing they were part of an experiment. Others discovered the truth only when it was too late to change their fate. In this way, Vault-Tec demonstrated the power of secrecy as a tool of control. Knowledge was rationed like food or water, doled out only to those in authority, while the masses lived in ignorance. The vaults became microcosms of the pre-war state itself, societies where a powerful few controlled the information and the lives of the many. One of the most chilling aspects of these experiments was the way in which they blurred the line between science and cruelty. To Vault-Tec, the suffering of the vault dwellers was not a tragedy, it was data. Every breakdown, every act of violence, every moment of despair was recorded, analyzed, and filed away. The vaults were laboratories of human misery, and the people inside were not citizens, but subjects. Even in cases where the experiments were less overtly cruel, the underlying philosophy remained the same. Control the environment, control the people, whether through scarcity, deception, or direct manipulation. The vaults reveal just how fragile human freedom could be when subjected to pressure. The methods used in the vaults were not entirely new. They reflected the broader culture of social engineering that had been present in America for decades. The resource wars had already shown how populations could be controlled through rationing, propaganda, and fear. Vault-Tec simply extended these techniques into a controlled environment, stripping away the complexities of the outside world to focus on pure, measurable outcomes. In many ways, the vaults were the logical endpoint of the society that created them, a nation obsessed with security, willing to trade liberty for survival, and eager to believe in the promises of those who held power. It is tempting to ask whether the vault experiments succeeded. From one perspective, they did. They produced a wealth of data on human behavior under extreme conditions. They demonstrated the ways in which people could be coerced, divided, and manipulated. They revealed the potential for biological experimentation, from mutation to conditioning. But from another perspective, they were failures, catastrophes that destroyed lives and communities without yielding any hope of a better future. The people who lived and died in the vaults were not saved. They were sacrificed. Their suffering did not rebuild America. It only scarred the wasteland that emerged in the war's aftermath. And yet, the philosophy of control embedded in Vault-Tec did not die with the company. It lived on in the post-war world, reflected in the authoritarian structures that emerged from the ruins. The Enclave, claiming to be the rightful continuation of the US government, embraced the same obsession with hierarchy and secrecy. The Brotherhood of Steel, though different in mission, maintained strict authority over its members and hoarded technology in the name of order. Even the new California Republic, founded on ideals of democracy, struggled with corruption, bureaucracy, and the manipulation of its citizens. In each case, echoes of Vault-Tec's experiments can be found. The vaults were not just isolated laboratories, they were prototypes for the systems of control that would shape the wasteland. Perhaps the most haunting lesson of the vaults is that control does not always require force. Often, it requires only fear and hope. Fear of what lies outside, and hope that what lies inside will be better. Vault-Tec understood this, and it used these tools with precision. The blast doors did not need to be locked from the outside. The people inside locked themselves in, believing they were safe. They followed the overseer's instructions, not because they were forced to, but because they believed in the authority of the system. Even when cracks appeared in the illusion, when people suspected that something was wrong, many chose to ignore it. To accept the truth was to accept that they had been deceived, that they were prisoners in a cage they had built themselves. And so they clung to the lie, even as it destroyed them. In the end, the science of control was Vault-Tec's greatest achievement and its greatest crime. It proved that people could be manipulated not only through force, but through belief. It showed that entire societies could be shaped by the conditions of their environment, by the scarcity of resources, by the presence or absence of authority. It demonstrated that humanity's greatest strength, its ability to trust, to cooperate, to hope, could also be its greatest weakness, easily turned against itself. This was the true legacy of Vault-Tec, and it is a legacy that continues to echo through the wasteland long after the last overseer terminal went dark and the last blast door rusted shut. When people speak of the vaults, There are certain numbers that echo across the wasteland like whispered legends. Among them, none carry the weight of Vault 13. To many, it was just another shelter, one of the 122 hidden beneath the earth. But Vault 13 was more than a sealed chamber of steel and concrete. It was the cradle of a myth, the birthplace of stories that would ripple outward to shape the destiny of entire nations. It was one of the most infamous of all the vaults because its history is entwined with the very first chapters of the Wasteland's rebirth. To understand Vault-Tec's legacy, we must understand what happened within its walls and how those events set in motion a chain reaction that would define the Fallout world forever. Vault 13 was, on the surface, among the few so-called control vaults. Its purpose, according to Vault-Tec's design, was to function exactly as advertised, with no hidden experimental variable. It was meant to operate as a baseline against which the more sinister vaults could be compared. Its inhabitants were intended to live out their lives in relative safety, shielded from the horrors of the outside world, and when conditions improved, they would emerge as proof of the vault system's success. At least, that was the official explanation. But as with everything Vault-Tec touched, even the control vaults were never entirely free from manipulation. Vault 13 was designated to remain sealed far longer than others, with a projected isolation period of 200 years. This alone made it a study in control, even if it was not labeled as such. For 2 centuries, its dwellers were to live cut off from the world, their lives measured not in years, but in generations. The vault was located in Southern California, a place that would become the crucible of post-war civilization. Inside its blast doors, the first generation of dwellers believed themselves to be the lucky few, chosen to inherit the future. They were given all the necessities of survival: food, water, shelter, power, and order. Overseer regulations structured their lives, and Vault-Tec systems maintained the illusion of normalcy. But time is the one element that cannot be controlled forever, and as the years passed, the fragile balance inside Vault 13 began to unravel. The critical turning point came not from rebellion or resource scarcity, but from technology itself. Vault 13's water chip, the device responsible for recycling and purifying the vault's supply, failed after just 84 years. It was not supposed to happen so soon. The failure threw the entire vault into crisis, for without a functioning water chip, the dwellers would face slow but certain death. In desperation, the overseer was forced to break the vault's most sacred rule. No one was to leave until the full term of isolation had been reached. But the circumstances left no choice. A single individual was selected to venture into the wasteland, to seek a replacement chip, and in doing so, to shatter the illusion of Vault 13's isolation forever. That individual would become known only as the Vault Dweller. Their journey into the wasteland was not just the story of one person searching for a piece of technology. It was the story of the wasteland itself, waking up to its own possibilities. For the first time, the sealed doors of Vault 13 opened to the irradiated sunlight of a world transformed, and one of its children walked free. The Vault Dwellers' mission brought them into contact with communities struggling to survive, raiders preying on the weak, and remnants of the old world still clinging to existence. Each step revealed the truth. The wasteland was not a dead world. It was alive, chaotic, and filled with the seeds of something new. The search for the water chip eventually led to the necropolis, a ruined city inhabited by ghouls. These were humans transformed by the long-term effects of radiation exposure, shunned and despised by many, yet clinging to survival. Among them was the chip that Vault 13 so desperately needed. By retrieving it, the Vault Dwellers saved their people. But the journey had already changed them, and what they had seen could not be unseen. The vault was no longer a sanctuary untouched by the outside. It was a cage, and the world beyond its doors was far more complex and alive than anyone inside had dared to imagine. Yet the story of Vault 13 did not end with the recovery of the water chip. The Vault Dweller's journey uncovered a threat that dwarfed even the scarcity of resources: the rise of the Master and his unity. In the ruins of a pre-war military facility, the forced evolutionary virus had given birth to a new vision of humanity. The Master sought to unify all surviving humans by transforming them into super mutants, believing this would create a species immune to radiation and disease. His plan threatened not only Vault 13, but every human settlement struggling to rebuild. It was in this crucible that the Vault Dweller became more than a courier of water. They became a savior, or, depending on the choices made, a destroyer. The Master's defeat at the hands of the Vault Dweller marked a turning point in wasteland history. For the first time, humanity had faced a threat born directly of pre-war science and triumphed. But the victory came at a cost. When the Vault Dweller returned to Vault 13, triumphant and burdened with knowledge, they were not welcomed as a hero. The Overseer, fearing that tales of the wasteland would destabilize the carefully controlled society within, exiled them. It was a betrayal that revealed the true nature of Vault-Tec's legacy. Even when salvation was delivered, the Vault system was incapable of accepting it. Control was more important than freedom, obedience more valuable than truth. The Vault Dweller was cast out into the very wasteland they had saved, condemned to wander while their people returned to the safety of ignorance. The story might have ended there, but history is never so simple. The descendants of the Vault Dweller would go on to shape entire nations. Their exile gave birth to a settlement known as Arroyo, a community that preserved both the spirit of the Vault and the lessons of the wasteland. From Arroyo would come the Chosen One, who would one day seek out Vault 13 again, this time in search of the Garden of Eden creation kit, a device meant to terraform and revitalize the land. In this way, the legacy of Vault 13 was bound not only to its original inhabitants, but to the generations that followed, intertwining the story of one vault with the story of an entire world. Vault 13's importance lies not only in the events that unfolded around it, but in what it revealed about the Vault program itself. It showed that even a so-called control vault was never truly free of manipulation. It demonstrated how fragile the illusion of safety was, and how quickly it could collapse when faced with the reality of the outside world. And it proved that from within the cages built by Vault-Tec, heroes could emerge, carrying with them the power to change the destiny of countless lives. The tale of Vault 13 is remembered in myths, in songs, and in the whispered stories of travelers. Some speak of it as a place of safety, others as a prison. Some see its people as fortunate, others as cursed. But all agree that it was a turning point, the moment when the vaults ceased to be sealed mysteries and became part of the living history of the wasteland. Vault 13 was never just a shelter, it was a doorway, and when it opened, it released not only a lone wanderer, but the future itself. And perhaps that is the greatest irony of all. Vault-Tec designed Vault 13 to remain closed for centuries, a time capsule sealed away from the world. Yet its story is one of opening, of escape, of exile, and of rebirth. The vault that was meant to preserve became the vault that changed everything. Its steel door, once a barrier, became a threshold. Beyond it lay the wasteland, harsh, unforgiving, but alive. And from it stepped the first of many who would prove that humanity's future could not be written in blueprints or overseer terminals. It could only be written in the choices of those brave enough to walk out into the unknown. Among all the vaults scattered across the wasteland, few have captured the imagination like Vault 111. To the unknowing eye, it appeared to be no different from its countless counterparts, another underground sanctuary with its familiar steel door and its promise of survival. But Vault 111 carried with it a secret purpose, one rooted not in the social experiments that define so many others, but in the manipulation of time itself. In this vault, the cruelty of Vault-Tec took on a new dimension, one that transformed the fate of its inhabitants into a living nightmare suspended between the old world and the new. Vault 111 was not a refuge, it was a cryogenic prison. The vault was built just outside Boston, in the heart of the Commonwealth, a region that would one day become a cauldron of competing powers. Its inhabitants were ordinary citizens, drawn from nearby neighborhoods, told that they had been granted a chance at survival in the event of nuclear war. Families were selected, screened, and admitted, not because they possessed special skills, but because they were expendable test subjects. On the 23rd of October 2077, the day the bombs fell, the chosen were rushed inside, guided by the illusion of safety as the great blast door sealed behind them. They believed they had been spared. In truth, they had been condemned. The stated purpose of Vault 111 was to test the long-term effects of suspended animation on human beings. While other vaults focused on social control, genetic manipulation, or psychological pressure, this one froze its inhabitants in place, locking them in pods of steel and glass. The residents were told it was part of the induction process, a temporary measure to ease their transition into vault life. In reality, there was never any plan to awaken them, at least not in the way they expected. One by one, they were placed in cryogenic stasis, their lives reduced to faint pulses on hidden monitors, their futures stolen before they could grasp what had been done. The cruel brilliance of this experiment lay in its simplicity. Cryogenic freezing would allow Vault-Tec to preserve people exactly as they were at the moment of the bombs. It was a way of controlling not just space, but time itself. Generations of vault dwellers could be studied not through their children and grandchildren, but through the same individuals, frozen and thawed at the company's whim. For the inhabitants of Vault 111, the passing of centuries would feel like a dreamless sleep, an instant in which their world vanished and another emerged. In this way, Vault-Tec could create living fossils, people displaced from their own era and forced to witness a world reborn in fire. What makes Vault 111's story unforgettable is not only the experiment itself, but the human tragedy that played out within its walls. Among the residents were a soldier, their spouse, and their infant child. Like the others, they entered the pods believing it was only temporary, unaware that their lives had been signed away. When the stasis fields activated, the world of pre-war America ceased to exist for them in the space of a heartbeat. In the blink of an eye, 2 centuries would pass, and the vault would stand silent, its inhabitants frozen in time. But the experiment did not remain undisturbed. Sometime after the bombs fell, Vault 111 was breached, not by raiders or by wastelanders, but by the Institute, the shadowy scientific organization that ruled the Commonwealth from the underground. The Institute sought genetic material untainted by centuries of radiation and mutation. The frozen subjects of Vault 111 were a perfect resource, relics of the old world whose DNA could be harvested for their experiments. It was during one of these incursions that tragedy struck. The cryopods were opened not to free their occupants, but to take from them what the Institute desired. The soldier's spouse was murdered before their very eyes, and their infant child stolen away into the darkness. Then, as if mocking the horror they had caused, the Institute resealed the pod, trapping the survivor once again in frozen stillness, condemned to relive the loss over and over, until fate intervened. When at last the cryogenic systems failed, more than 200 years had passed since the bombs fell. The survivor of Vault 111 awoke into a world unrecognizable, a wasteland of crumbling ruins, lawless raiders, and mutated beasts. They were the sole survivor, the last living testament to Vault-111's experiment. For them, the apocalypse had not been a slow erosion across generations. It had been instantaneous. In one moment, the world was alive with the hum of pre-war America. In the next, it was gone, replaced by ash and silence. The shock of this transition is one of the cruelest legacies of Vault-111, for it robbed its dwellers not only of their future, but of their past. The story of the sole survivor is one of personal grief woven into the fabric of a changing world. Driven by the loss of their child, they ventured out into the Commonwealth, becoming a pivotal figure in the struggles that defined the region. Their actions touched the destinies of countless groups: the Brotherhood of Steel, the Railroad, the Minutemen, and the Institute itself. But behind the legends of their choices lies the shadow of Vault-111, a reminder that all of their heroism was born from an experiment that never should have been. The Vault was not a sanctuary that birthed a savior. It was a prison that created a ghost of the old world, cast adrift in a future that did not belong to them. Vault-111 is often remembered in contrast to the other vaults because it represents a different kind of cruelty. Where Vault-11 forced its dwellers to sacrifice one another, and Vault-87 twisted its people into monsters, Vault-111's torment was subtler, colder. It was the theft of time, the denial of choice, and the transformation of ordinary lives into tools of scientific exploitation. Its subjects were not destroyed outright. They were preserved, their suffering stretched across centuries, their humanity reduced to samples in a laboratory's ledger. In this way, Vault-111 epitomized the heart of Vault-Tec's philosophy, that people were not citizens or individuals, but resources to be used, manipulated, and discarded. And yet, from that cruelty arose something Vault-Tec could never have predicted. The sole survivor's journey proved that even when stripped of everything, family, home, time itself, human beings retain a capacity for resilience, for determination, and for shaping the world around them. Vault-111 sought to freeze life in place, to suspend humanity in an endless cycle of exploitation. Instead, it released a figure who would ignite revolutions, topple powers, and forge new alliances in the wasteland. It is a reminder that no matter how carefully control is imposed, there are always cracks in the system through which defiance can emerge. When we reflect on Vault-111, it is tempting to focus solely on the tragedy, the families who never awoke, the lives extinguished without ever being lived, the innocence stolen in the name of science. But to stop there would be to miss the deeper truth. Vault-111 is not just a monument to suffering, it is also a monument to survival. It shows us that even in the most sterile and hopeless of circumstances, the human spirit endures. The survivor who walked out of Vault-111 did not do so as a victim. They did so as a witness, carrying with them the memories of a world long gone and the determination to ensure that its mistakes would not be repeated. In the rusting husk of Vault-111, we see both the horror and the hope of the Vault program. It stands as proof that time itself can be weaponized, that lives can be bent across centuries by the cold logic of experimentation. But it also stands as proof that even when reduced to pawns in a cruel design, people are not so easily broken. For all the power that Vault-Tec wielded, it could not control what its subjects became when they finally stepped out into the Sunday. In that moment, the cryogenic prison became something else, a birthplace of vengeance, of purpose, and of change. If there is a vault that embodies the very darkest depths of Vault-Tec's ambition, it is Vault-87. It was not built to preserve life, nor even to test the limits of human society in some twisted social experiment. Its purpose was more direct, more cruel, and more devastating. Vault-87 was created as a crucible for mutation, a laboratory in which the forced evolutionary virus would be unleashed upon unwitting subjects. The horrors that took place within its walls gave birth to one of the most enduring terrors of the wasteland, the supermutants of the capital wasteland. Unlike other vaults, whose stories ended with tragedy confined to their interiors, the legacy of Vault-87 spilled outward, poisoning the land around it with its monstrous creations. To understand the Vault, one must first understand the virus. The Forced Evolutionary Virus, or FEV, was a pre-war creation born of the military-industrial obsession with supremacy. Its origins trace back to Vault-Tec, where scientists sought to engineer soldiers who could resist disease, radiation, and chemical attack. The war looming on the horizon demanded a weapon that was not a bomb or a bullet, but a body, a soldier who could endure anything. The FEV was their answer, a retrovirus designed to rewrite human DNA, enhancing strength, durability, and intelligence. Yet the results were unpredictable, grotesque, and unstable. Entire populations of test subjects were twisted into something neither fully human nor fully monstrous, their individuality erased in the name of evolution. Vault-87 was chosen as the site where the virus would be tested on a population scale. Its dwellers, who entered believing they had been saved from nuclear fire, were instead handed over to the experiments. From the moment the blast door sealed, their fate was written. The virus was introduced into the vault not as an accident, but as design. Subjects were taken from their families, exposed to FEV, and studied as they underwent horrific transformations. Those who survived emerged as hulking brutes, stripped of memory and humanity, driven by violent impulses and reproductive obsession. Those who did not survive were discarded, their lives erased in silence. The vault itself became a factory, its purpose not to protect, but to produce. The cruelty of Vault-87 was compounded by its secrecy. Unlike other vaults, where dwellers eventually uncovered the truth of their situation, the inhabitants of Vault-87 had no chance to resist. The virus consumed them, one by one, until nothing of the original population remained. Over time, the vault ceased to be a place of human habitation. It became a breeding ground for super mutants, the last remnants of Vault-Tec's experiment still clinging to their ruined home. For 2 centuries, the vault remained active, its chambers filled with grotesque machinery and the echoes of suffering long past, even as its creations roamed the wasteland. The supermutants of Vault-87 were distinct from those of other regions. Unlike the Mariposa strain that produced mutants on the West Coast, the Capital Wasteland strain was particularly unstable. Mutants born of Vault-87 were aggressive, infertile, and obsessed with capturing humans for further experimentation. They lacked the intelligence of their Western cousins, devolving instead into brutal warbands that terrorized the ruins of Washington, D.C. Yet they carried with them a terrible persistence, for every human they captured was subjected to the same FEV process, continuing the cycle of mutation. In this way, the Vault's experiment extended its reach far beyond its steel walls, perpetuating itself through abduction and forced transformation. It is worth pausing to consider the scale of this cruelty. Vault-87 did not merely destroy the lives of its original inhabitants, it unleashed a curse upon the entire capital wasteland. For centuries, its mutants stalked the ruins, preying upon travelers, settlements, and scavengers. They filled the city's abandoned metro tunnels, turned its landmarks into nests, and shattered any fragile sense of safety that might have existed. For survivors struggling to rebuild civilization among the ashes of the old world, the mutants were a constant reminder that the horrors of pre-war science were not gone, but alive, hunting, and multiplying. And yet, within this horror lay the faintest echoes of humanity. Some of the Vault-87 mutants retained fragments of memory, brief glimpses of the people they had once been. They built crude societies, established lairs, and followed leaders of their own. Chief among them was a mutant named Fawkes, who had been a prisoner within the vault's depths, condemned to experimentation. But unlike his brethren, Fawkes somehow survived with his mind intact, his intelligence preserved even as his body was transformed. In his story, we see the cruel irony of Vault-87's work. In its quest to create an improved human, it had inadvertently forged a rare being who embodied both the strength of the mutation and the spirit of the person who came before. Fawkes' escape from Vault-87 revealed the interior of the vault to the wider wasteland for the first time. Within its darkened corridors lay the evidence of centuries of torment. Laboratories filled with broken pods, hallways littered with the remnants of failed experiments, and the ever-present hum of machinery still devoted to its endless, mindless task. To walk through Vault-87 was to step into a nightmare frozen in time, where every wall whispered of pain and every chamber bore witness to the crimes of Vault-Tec. It was not simply a ruin. It was a wound in the earth, festering long after the war had ended. The legacy of Vault-87 is not limited to its mutants. It serves as a symbol of how easily science can be twisted when guided not by morality, but by ambition. The FEV was born of fear, the fear of defeat, the fear of weakness, the fear of being outmatched by enemies both foreign and imagined. Vault-87 was the vessel in which that fear was unleashed without restraint. In the end, it created not a super soldier, but a plague of monsters who destroyed more than they ever protected. This is the true horror of Vault-87. Not only the suffering of its inhabitants, but the realization that their fate was the logical consequence of the world that built the vaults in the first place. And yet, as with so many vaults, the story does not end in despair alone. From the depths of Vault-87 came both terror and hope. The mutants spread fear across the capital wasteland, but from among them emerged figures like Fawkes, who proved that even in the most controlled and corrupted of environments, individuality could survive. The vault's horrors became a crucible for heroes as well, those who ventured into its depths to confront the monsters within and to wrest from its heart the truths that would shape the fate of the wasteland. In this way, Vault-87's legacy is twofold. It is a warning of the dangers of unchecked science, and it is a testament to the resilience of those who refuse to be broken by it. When we look back at Vault-87, we see not just a chapter in the history of the wasteland, but a mirror held up to the pre-war world. Its experiments were not aberrations. They were continuations of a mindset that valued power over compassion, control over freedom, and survival at any cost. The mutants of Vault-87 are not merely monsters. They are the children of that world, born of its arrogance and its fear. And as long as they roam the ruins of Washington, D.C., they remind us that the past is never truly buried. It lives on in every shadowed tunnel, in every ruined street, in every cry that echoes through the night. Vault-87 is the past made flesh, and its lesson is written in scars across the wasteland. Vault-87 is remembered in hushed tones, a place whose very name conjures images of terror, mutation, and despair. Of all the vaults scattered across the post-war landscape, few embody the cruelty of Vault-Tec's ambitions more fully than this one. Hidden in the rolling hills of the capital wasteland, Vault-87 was not designed as a refuge. It was a laboratory, a crucible in which humanity was to be broken down and remade in the image of its overseers. At its heart lay one of the most dangerous and infamous creations of the pre-war world, the forced evolutionary virus. The horrors that unfolded within its steel walls gave rise to creatures that would haunt the wasteland for centuries, creatures known simply as super mutants. The Forced Evolutionary Virus, or FEV, was the product of a project that predated the Great War. Initially conceived as a tool for enhancing human resilience, FEV was meant to make soldiers immune to radiation, disease, and even aging. In the minds of the military and their corporate partners, it was the key to creating a new kind of soldier, one capable of surviving in environments where ordinary humans could not. Vault-Tec, ever eager to push the limits of human experimentation, took hold of this research and made it the centerpiece of Vault-87. The Vault was never intended to protect its inhabitants from the bombs. It was meant to lock them inside with FEV and observe the results as generation after generation was subjected to forced transformation. The design of Vault-87 reflected this sinister purpose. Its laboratories were extensive, filled with containment chambers, observation rooms, and storage for vast quantities of the virus. The overseer's role was not to safeguard lives, but to ensure that the experiments continued without interruption. Test subjects were chosen from among the population of the Vault, and resistance was met with brutality. Those who were injected with FEV were not given a choice, nor were they told the true nature of what was happening. They were told it was for the good of humanity, for the survival of the species. What followed was agony. The virus worked by rewriting human DNA, forcing cells to replicate endlessly, strengthening the body, enlarging muscles, thickening bones. But the price of this transformation was devastating. Those exposed to the virus lost not only their human appearance, but their very sense of self. Memory fragmented, intelligence withered, and the capacity for empathy vanished. What remained was strength without reason, power without restraint, and hunger without end. The first super mutants emerged from Vault-87's laboratories as towering brutes, their green, mottled skin stretched over unnatural muscle, their eyes devoid of humanity. They were soldiers without a war, weapons with no master but instinct. The inhabitants of the Vault soon realized the truth of their situation. One by one, their friends, neighbors, and loved ones were taken to the laboratories, never to return in human form. The community that had once been promised safety became a pool of test subjects, their lives reduced to data points in a cruel experiment. Fear consumed them, for there was no escape. Vault-87's door had been sealed against the outside world, and within, the Overseer ensured that no rebellion could succeed. In time, the human population dwindled, replaced by the mutants that stalked the corridors. The Overseer's authority became irrelevant, for the experiment had outgrown its architects. The Vault had become a factory, producing monstrosities that no longer needed control. When the Great War ended and centuries passed, Vault-87 remained hidden, its steel walls concealing the horrors within. But the super mutants it produced did not stay contained. They roamed the capital wasteland, spreading outward in bands that kidnapped humans and dragged them back to the Vault for forced conversion. To the people of the wasteland, they became an ever-present terror, raiding settlements, slaughtering travelers, and populating their ranks with unwilling victims. Unlike raiders or other hostile groups, super mutants could not be reasoned with, for they did not see humans as equals. To them, humans were raw material, vessels to be broken down and rebuilt in the same twisted image. Every human they captured was another potential soldier, another cog in the endless machine that Vault-87 had set in motion. The presence of super mutants in the capital wasteland shaped its very culture. Settlements lived in constant fear of abduction. Families whispered warnings to their children about the green giants that prowled the night, and the roads between communities became hunting grounds. The mutants were not simply predators, they were a plague, spreading the nightmare of Vault-87 across the region. And unlike other threats, they could not be destroyed at their source, for their numbers replenished as long as humans remained to be captured. Vault 87, sealed and inaccessible due to lethal radiation surrounding its entrance, continued its dark work even without overseers, its laboratories still filled with vats of FEV, its purpose carried on by the mutants themselves. For the lone wanderer, the truth of Vault 87 became clear during their search for Project Purity. Venturing into the vault revealed the nightmare within. Endless corridors filled with the sounds of mutant roars, laboratories stained with the remnants of failed experiments, and the heavy stench of death and decay. It was here that the wanderer encountered Fawkes, a mutant unlike the others. Once a human prisoner destined for experimentation, Fawkes had been exposed to FEV, but unlike most, his transformation had preserved his mind. He retained his intelligence, his morality, his humanity, even as his body was forever altered. Fawkes became living proof that the virus did not always destroy. It twisted, it reshaped, but in rare cases, it could create something new, a being with strength and intelligence combined. For the Wanderer, Fawkes was both ally and warning, a reminder that the line between salvation and damnation was thin, and that Vault 87's work had produced not only monsters but rare anomalies of hope. The tragedy of Vault 87 lies not only in its victims but in its purpose. It was not a vault that failed, it was a vault that succeeded in exactly what it was designed to do. Unlike Vault 22, where an experiment spiraled out of control, or Vault 101, where the illusion of safety eventually broke apart, Vault 87 fulfilled its directive with ruthless efficiency. It created an army, not of loyal soldiers, but of twisted mockeries of humanity, an army that would outlive its creators and terrorize the wasteland for centuries. In this sense, Vault 87 stands as perhaps the purest example of Vault-Tec's philosophy, that people were not lives to be preserved, but tools to be reshaped, data to be harvested, and resources to be consumed. The legacy of Vault 87 still lingers in the ruins of the capital wasteland. The supermutants that roam its streets are not simply random monsters. They are the children of that vault, echoes of an experiment that never truly ended. Each one is a reminder of the arrogance of those who believed they could perfect humanity through force. Each one is a symbol of how science, unbound by ethics, becomes indistinguishable from cruelty, and each one stands as a warning to those who still believe that control is worth any price. Vault 87 is not remembered for its architecture, its overseer, or even its location. It is remembered for the monsters it unleashed, for the way it twisted hope into horror, and for the shadow it cast across an entire region. It reminds us that sometimes the greatest dangers are not the bombs that fall from the sky, but the experiments that continue in the dark, hidden from sight, waiting for their time to emerge. For, in the heart of Vault 87, humanity's quest for survival became its own undoing, and the line between savior and monster was erased forever. Vault 22 was a place where life was meant to be preserved, where humanity's future would be secured not through isolation, but through cultivation. Deep in the Mojave Desert, far from the shattered cities and crumbling highways, this vault became the home of a project unlike any other. Instead of sealing its inhabitants away from the outside world forever, Vault 22 was conceived as a sanctuary of science, dedicated to the study of agriculture. In an age where famine and resource scarcity had driven nations to war, Vault-Tec promised that Vault 22 would be the birthplace of a revolution, a place where food could be grown endlessly, where crops would be engineered to thrive under any conditions, and where humanity could, at last, be freed from hunger. But in typical Vault-Tec fashion, this noble vision masked a darker purpose, and what began as a haven soon became a horror. The design of Vault 22 reflected its mission. Unlike other vaults, whose sterile corridors were lined only with steel, this vault was alive. Hydroponic gardens stretched through entire wings, their glass walls shimmering with condensation, their chambers filled with the scent of earth and growing things. Crops of every variety were nurtured under artificial lights, each genetically altered, tested, and retested by scientists who believed they were on the brink of discovering a new way of feeding the world. For the inhabitants, life seemed idyllic. While other vaults descended into tyranny or madness, Vault 22 flourished with greenery, its air rich with oxygen, its people surrounded by abundance. But hidden within that abundance was the seed of catastrophe. Vault-Tec's true interest in Vault 22 was not in feeding humanity, but in reshaping it. The company's scientists, in partnership with the government, were less concerned with the promise of agriculture than with the potential of biological control. By engineering plants that could survive anywhere, that could grow without restraint, they hoped to unlock the key to both survival and dominance. Crops that grew without soil, that thrived in toxic conditions, that resisted every form of blight, such creations could not only ensure survival in the post-war wasteland, but could also be weaponized, unleashed upon enemies as a plague of greenery that consumed entire landscapes. Vault 22, then, was never simply about food. It was about control and the weaponization of life itself. The turning point came when one of the experiments achieved a breakthrough. A species of fungus was developed that could accelerate plant growth to extraordinary levels, bonding symbiotically with its host and spreading rapidly through spores. At first, it seemed a miracle. Crops grew to maturity in a fraction of the time, replenishing themselves endlessly, producing yields far beyond expectation. The scientists celebrated, believing they had discovered the future of agriculture. But the fungus carried with it a terrible side effect. It was not content to remain bound to crops. It spread through the vault itself, infecting anything organic. Plants grew wild, creeping across walls, tearing through vents, pushing their way into every corner of the structure. The vault that had once been a garden became an overgrown jungle, its steel skeleton swallowed by vines and spores. The infection did not stop with plants. As the fungus spread, it adapted to new hosts. Insects and small animals became carriers, their bodies twisted by parasitic growths, and then it began to infect the people. Those exposed to the spores found themselves coughing, choking, their lungs filling with the invisible particles. At first, symptoms resembled illness, fever, dizziness, difficulty breathing, but soon the true horror revealed itself. The infected began to lose their sense of self, their bodies slowly overtaken by the parasitic growths. Fungus sprouted from their flesh, consuming them from within, transforming them into shambling husks driven not by thought but by the instinct of the spores. These were the spore carriers, grotesque hybrids of human and fungus, forever trapped between life and death, their humanity erased. Panic tore through Vault 22. Scientists who had once celebrated their success now watched their colleagues become something unrecognizable. Families barricaded themselves within their quarters, hoping to escape the creeping tide of greenery. But the spores were relentless, spreading through ventilation systems, seeping through cracks, drifting invisibly in the air. There was no escaping them. One by one, the inhabitants succumbed, their screams swallowed by the sound of rustling leaves and the slow, steady spread of vines. The vault that had been humanity's hope became its tomb, a living monument to the dangers of unchecked ambition. In the centuries that followed, Vault 22 remained sealed, its doors locked not by order, but by the chaos within. From the outside, it seemed abandoned, another relic of the old world. But inside, the experiment never ended. The plants continued to grow, unchecked, filling chamber after chamber with lush, choking vegetation. The spore carriers lingered in the shadows, their bodies sustained by the fungus that had consumed them, waiting for any who might wander into their domain. The vault became a trap, a place where curiosity meant death, where the air itself carried the seeds of infection. When survivors of the Mojave began to explore Vault 22 inches the years following the Great War, they found not a vault, but a jungle. Steel walls dripped with condensation, vines hung from ceilings, and spores drifted in the air like dust. The deeper they ventured, the clearer the tragedy became. Terminals told the story of scientists who had realized too late the mistake they had made, of researchers who tried desperately to contain the spread, sealing off sections of the vault in a futile attempt to stop the inevitable. Their words, preserved in data logs, spoke of fear, regret, and the slow realization that they were no longer masters of their experiment, but its victims. For the explorers, these records served as both warning and epitaph. Vault 22 was not simply abandoned, it was devoured. In the years that followed, the vault became a source of both horror and temptation for the Mojave's people. Rumors spread of the bounty of food hidden within, of crops that could feed entire communities. The desperate and the greedy alike were drawn to it, believing they might harness its resources. But few who entered ever returned, and those who did spoke of shadows that moved like people but weren't, of air so thick with spores that every breath felt like poison, of whispers in the darkness that might have been voices, or might have been the rustling of leaves. Vault 22 gained a reputation not as a place of salvation, but as a death trap, a cursed ruin where nature itself turned against intruders. The significance of Vault 22 lies not only in its horror, but in the lesson it offers. It reveals the hubris of Vault-Tec, the belief that life itself could be bent to their will, that biology could be rewritten without consequence. In their arrogance, they forgot that life does not obey human command, that when tampered with, it evolves, adapts, and resists. The fungus of Vault 22 was not evil, it was nature responding to interference, reshaping itself to survive. But for the people of the vault, that response was indistinguishable from a curse, and for the wasteland beyond, it became yet another reminder that the past's sins still haunted the present. Today, Vault 22 stands as a testament to the duality of life and death. Within its walls, plants still flourish, untouched by human hands, thriving in an environment built to sustain them. It is both a nightmare and a wonder, a vision of what the earth might become if humanity were no longer present to shape it. To some, it is terrifying, a glimpse of a future where people are no longer necessary, where life carries on without them. To others, it is beautiful, proof that even in the ashes of war, life finds a way. But to all who know its story, it remains a warning that ambition without caution leads only to ruin, and that Vault-Tec's pursuit of control often brought only chaos. Vault 22 was never meant to feed humanity. It was meant to test the limits of control, to see how far life itself could be bent before it broke. In the end, it proved that control is an illusion. The vault's inhabitants became part of the very experiment they sought to master, consumed by the growth they had created, transformed into something less than human but more than dead. Their legacy is not one of salvation, but of caution, a reminder carved into the steel and vines of the Mojave that even in the smallest seed lies the power to unmake the world. Among the many vaults scattered across America, Vault 101 holds a special place in the mythology of the wasteland. To its residents, it was the entire world, a sealed chamber of steel and concrete that promised safety from the fire above and certainty in a world of chaos. To the people of the capital wasteland, it became the birthplace of a legend, the point of origin for one who would come to be known as the Lone Wanderer. But beyond its fame and the stories that followed, Vault 101 is perhaps the purest expression of Vault-Tec's obsession with control, for it was a vault designed never to open. Located in the ruins of Washington, D.C., Vault 101 was established with a simple yet devastating directive. Its door was to remain closed forever. While other vaults were built to open after a set number of years, releasing their populations into the wasteland, Vault 101's purpose was eternal isolation. Its dwellers were told that the outside world was uninhabitable, that the bombs had poisoned the surface beyond repair, and that only within the vault could humanity survive. Generations would be born and die within its walls, believing they were the last remnants of humankind. In this way, Vault 101 was not a refuge, but a cage of lies, designed to study how a population could be controlled across centuries through fear and deception. Life inside Vault 101 was rigid, ordered, and suffocating. The Overseer ruled with an iron hand, supported by a small cadre of loyal enforcers who ensured that no dissent could take root. The Vault's rules were clear: no one enters, and no one leaves. This mantra was drilled into every resident from the moment they could walk. School lessons reinforced the Overseer's authority, reminding children that obedience was survival. Careers were assigned, lives predetermined, individuality stifled in the name of harmony. To question the system was to invite punishment, and to dream of the outside was to commit heresy. Vault 101 was not simply a society. It was an experiment in obedience, one where the Overseer's power was absolute, and where every human relationship was twisted by the presence of fear. The inhabitants, for the most part, accepted their fate. For many, the vault was all they had ever known, and the outside world was a phantom, a story told only to warn them of dangers they could never face. The walls of steel were both their prison and their comfort. But beneath the surface, cracks began to form, whispers of discontent grew, friendships strained under the Overseer's watchful gaze, and the sense of safety began to suffocate those who dared to imagine something more. Into this fragile world was born the child who would one day become the Lone Wanderer. From their earliest years, the Lone Wanderer was shaped by the Vault's contradictions. They were raised by their father, James, a man of science whose presence carried with it an air of mystery. James was no ordinary vault dweller. He had lived a life before Vault 101, and his presence there was the result of choices and secrets that would one day unravel the Overseer's lies. To the young wanderer, however, he was simply a father, a guide, a protector, and the source of the rare warmth in a world of cold rules. Their bond would become the spark that ignited the story of Vault 101, for when James disappeared into the wasteland, the vault itself could no longer contain what was coming. The disappearance of James shattered the illusion of permanence. The Overseer, fearing that the outside world would seep into the minds of his people, tightened his grip. Order was enforced through violence, dissent crushed without hesitation. Yet the truth could not be hidden. If James could leave the vault, then the mantra was a lie. The Wanderer, in searching for their father, discovered the truth that generations had been denied. The vault door could open, the cage could be escaped, and beyond it lay not death, but life. When the Lone Wanderer stepped out into the sunlight, the world of Vault 101 was forever changed. For the first time in 2 centuries, one of its children had crossed the threshold, leaving behind the lies of the Overseer for the unknown of the wasteland. The journey that followed would carry the Wanderer across the capital wasteland, from the shattered monuments of Washington, D.C., to the hidden laboratories of Project Purity. Along the way, they would encounter the many faces of the post-war world. Raiders preying on the weak, Mutants spawned from Vault-87's horrors, the Brotherhood of Steel with their armored might, and the Enclave, the shadow of the old government still grasping for power. But while the Lone Wanderer's story became the tale of a hero, or a tyrant, depending on the choices made, the fate of Vault 101 continued to unfold behind its sealed door. The vault was left divided in the Wanderer's absence. Some clung to the Overseer's authority, desperate to preserve the illusion of safety. Others saw the truth and demanded freedom, inspired by the one who had proven that the outside was survivable. Tensions grew, leading to unrest, and for the first time, the people of Vault 101 had to choose between obedience and rebellion. In this way, the vault itself became a reflection of the wasteland beyond, a place where control faltered and where the human spirit refused to remain chained. The tragedy of Vault 101 lies in the simplicity of its design. Unlike other vaults, whose experiments were grotesque or bizarre, this one required nothing more than patience. By telling its inhabitants a lie and sealing them away, Vault-Tec created a society where control was achieved not through violence or drugs, but through belief. The people of Vault 101 obeyed not because they were forced to, but because they believed they had no other choice. Their cage was as much mental as physical, a testament to how easily humanity could be controlled when knowledge was withheld. And, yet, as with every vault, cracks appeared. The Lone Wanderer's story is proof that even the strongest walls cannot hold forever. The Overseer could not predict that a single departure would unravel centuries of control, nor could he stop the tide of truth once it had begun to flow. Vault 101 stands as a lesson, not only in the dangers of authoritarianism, but in the resilience of those who dare to question. It reminds us that even in the most controlled of environments, the human desire for freedom cannot be erased. In the end, Vault 101 is remembered not as a place of safety, but as a birthplace of defiance. It gave the wasteland one of its greatest figures, a wanderer whose actions reshaped the capital wasteland, and whose choices echoed across the lives of countless survivors. But it also left behind a scar, a reminder that for every hero who steps out into the sun, countless others remain behind, trapped in cages of fear and lies. The vault that was never meant to open did open, and in doing so, it revealed the truth that Vault-Tec had tried to bury. No wall is eternal, and no lie lasts forever. Vault 11 is one of the most infamous vaults in the Mojave, not for monsters or biological horrors, but for the way it twisted the very idea of human society against itself. Unlike Vault 87 or Vault 22, its walls did not hide grotesque mutations or spreading plagues. Instead, it became the stage for a psychological experiment so cruel that its victims destroyed one another without the need for violence from their overseers. The tragedy of Vault 11 reveals how manipulation of belief and authority can corrode a community until it consumes itself, leaving behind nothing but silence and the faint echo of screams. The directive for Vault 11 was deceptively simple. Upon entering the vault, the inhabitants were informed that each year they were required to select one member of their community to sacrifice. That individual would be taken to the Overseer's office and executed. If the residents failed to comply, if they refused to carry out this grim ritual, the entire vault would be exterminated. The message was clear: kill one or kill all. It was a test not of biology or technology, but of morality, an examination of how long a society could endure under the weight of enforced sacrifice. The first Overseer relayed the instructions, and at first, panic and despair spread throughout the population. People wept, shouted, and begged for another way. But when the time came, the vote was held. In fear of annihilation, the people chose one among them. That person was led to the chamber, and the vault's cycle of sacrifice began. Each year, the ritual repeated. Each year, one life was claimed, offered up as the price of survival, and each year, the weight of that choice pressed heavier on the hearts of those who remained. It did not take long for the process to warp the community's spirit. At first, the vote was a solemn affair, a grim duty carried out with reluctance. But soon, politics seeped in. Factions emerged, groups who sought to control the outcome, who manipulated fear to push their rivals into the noose. Elections became less about governance and more about condemnation. Campaigns promised safety and vengeance, slandering opponents, ensuring that the despised and the unwanted would be chosen to die. What began as survival soon became a weapon. Neighbors turned on one another, friendships crumbled, families fractured. The ballot box, once a symbol of democracy, became an instrument of death. Overseers rotated, each one doomed by design. For it was not only the community that voted on who would be sacrificed. The overseer themselves was always the most vulnerable. To be chosen as overseer was, in many cases, a death sentence. For the population quickly realized that the easiest way to preserve themselves was to place their leaders in the firing line. In time, the overseer position became one of terror rather than power. Those who accepted the role did so, knowing their days were numbered, and many did not survive a single year before being marched to their deaths. The institution of leadership itself was broken, not by incompetence or corruption, but by a system designed to ensure its destruction. The people of Vault-11 spiraled deeper into cruelty and despair. The yearly ritual became a spectacle, a grim tradition that consumed the community. Some factions thrived on the power it granted them, weaponizing fear to dominate their neighbors. Others fell into apathy, accepting death as inevitable, refusing to fight the system that bound them. And a few, just a few, began to wonder whether the overseer's instructions were a lie. But by then, it was too late. Generations had already lived and died under the shadow of sacrifice, their humanity eroded by the unrelenting cycle of death. The tragedy reached its climax when nearly the entire Vault descended into civil war. After years of infighting, betrayal, and bloodshed, only 5 survivors remained. Exhausted, broken, and haunted by the destruction of their community, they resolved to defy the system once and for all. When the time came for the next vote, they refused. They would not choose another to die. They would rather perish together than continue the cycle that had consumed their families and friends. With heavy hearts, they prepared to face the punishment they had been told would follow. But when they carried out their act of defiance, the truth was revealed. The Vault system did not annihilate them. Instead, a message played over the speakers. The Overseer's terminal revealed the true purpose of Vault-11's experiment. They had never been required to sacrifice anyone. The instruction had been a lie, a test of morality. The true experiment was whether the population would choose compassion or cruelty, whether they would stand together or destroy one another. If the inhabitants had ever refused to comply from the beginning, if they had chosen to reject the lie, the Vault systems would have congratulated them and set them free. But by giving in, by sacrificing their fellows year after year, they had condemned themselves. The message revealed this with chilling clarity, congratulating those who had finally chosen to resist. But for the survivors, the revelation was hollow. Their community was already gone. Hundreds had been killed, not by any automated system, but by their own hands, their own willingness to believe in fear and follow its dictates. The Vault's true weapon had been its instructions, and its true victims were not the dead, but the living who carried the guilt of having betrayed them. In despair, 4 of the 5 survivors took their own lives, unable to bear the weight of what they had done. Only one walked out of Vault-11 alive, carrying the story of its destruction into the Mojave. The story of Vault-11 is a reminder of the fragility of human society under pressure. Unlike other vaults, There were no monsters lurking in its halls, no deadly plagues, no unstoppable viruses. The people destroyed themselves with nothing more than fear and obedience. By accepting the overseer's words without question, by choosing survival over compassion, they turned democracy into a weapon and condemned their community to ruin. It is one of the clearest examples of Vault-Tec's philosophy that the greatest dangers are not external, but internal, that humanity itself is its own worst enemy when manipulated through lies. The lesson of Vault-11 resonates across the wasteland. It reveals how easily systems of governance can be corrupted, how democracy can be transformed into tyranny when manipulated by fear. It shows how communities can be divided, not by outside enemies, but by the belief that survival requires betrayal. And it stands as one of the cruelest experiments ever carried out by Vault-Tec, for unlike the physical horrors of other vaults, this one inflicted wounds on the soul, scars that lingered long after the experiment ended. Today, Vault-11 lies abandoned, its chambers silent, its voting terminals gathering dust. The murals that once adorned its walls, painted by hopeful residents, now seem grotesque, depicting smiling faces and slogans of unity that were never realized. The overseer's office, once the site of countless executions, is nothing more than an empty chair. The vault is a tomb, not just for bodies, but for ideals, proof that even the noblest concepts, when corrupted, can become instruments of destruction. And yet, in its final act, Vault-11 offered hope. For though nearly all of its residents succumbed, though its halls were stained with betrayal and blood, there was still that moment of defiance, that final act of resistance in which the last survivors chose to reject the lie. In doing so, they uncovered the truth, even if it came too late to save them. Their story is both caution and inspiration, a warning of how fear can destroy, but also a reminder that even in the darkest of circumstances, humanity retains the capacity to choose differently. Vault-11 may have failed its people, but it succeeded in demonstrating the dangers of obedience to false authority. It remains one of the most haunting legacies of Vault-Tec's experiments, a testament to how easily trust can be twisted and how fragile the bonds of community become when survival is placed above morality. Its halls may be silent now, but the story it left behind continues to echo, a ghostly reminder carved into the Mojave that the line between democracy and tyranny is thinner than we care to admit, and that sometimes the cruelest prisons are the ones we build for ourselves. Vault 112 was, at first glance, one of Vault-Tec's most advanced and comfortable shelters. Hidden deep beneath the capital wasteland, its structure was pristine compared to the rusting ruins of many other vaults. Its residents were placed into sealed pods, life support capsules linked to an advanced virtual reality system. Unlike Vault-11, where democracy was perverted into a weapon of fear, Vault 112's horrors came not from within the community, but from the mind of one man, Dr. Stanislaus Braun, the chief scientist behind the experiment. His brilliance was matched only by his cruelty, and under his guidance, Vault 112 became less a sanctuary and more a laboratory of nightmares. When the vault was sealed at the dawn of the Great War, its inhabitants were placed into cryogenic-like stasis, their minds linked to Braun's simulation. In this artificial world, he crafted what appeared to be a serene, idyllic 1952-style suburban neighborhood called Tranquility Lane. The streets were calm, the homes well kept, the lawns trimmed, and the sky forever blue. To an outsider, it might have looked like paradise, but beneath the perfect veneer lurked a hidden truth. The residents of Vault 112 were prisoners, unable to wake, bound to Braun's imagination. And in Tranquility Lane, Braun's imagination was a sadist's playground. Braun held complete control over the simulation. Every action, every rule, every event was dictated by his whims. The residents, stripped of memory and identity, lived as characters in his world, believing themselves to be simple suburban citizens. They were unaware that their lives before the vault had ever existed. They were trapped in endless cycles of manipulation, subjected to Braun's twisted scenarios. At times, he forced them into horrific acts of violence, convincing them that cruelty was a neighborly duty. At others, he tormented them with impossible situations, watching as they broke under the strain. He relished their suffering, taking on different personas within the simulation to orchestrate his games. In one of his most infamous roles, Braun appeared as a little girl named Betty. Through this disguise, he exercised godlike authority, bending the residents to his will, issuing commands that ranged from the humiliating to the grotesque. He forced neighbors to turn against one another, demanded acts of betrayal, and delighted in their despair when they realized they had no choice but to obey. The veneer of innocence, an eternal child with a doll's face, only made the cruelty more perverse. To Braun, Tranquility Lane was not a refuge, but a stage upon which he played out his darkest fantasies. The experiment was not designed to test the limits of survival, as in other vaults. Instead, it was a reflection of Braun himself, a monument to his unchecked power. Vault-Tec granted him free rein, trusting in his expertise, but what they created was a prison for his ego. He became not a caretaker, but a tormentor, indulging his cruelty with the helpless residents as his toys. Time lost all meaning in Vault 112. The inhabitants, trapped in perpetual simulation, did not age. Their bodies, suspended in the pods, were sustained indefinitely. Their minds, however, were subjected to an eternity of Braun's control. For them, there was no death, no escape, only endless manipulation. The cruel irony is that Vault 112 might have been the most technically successful of Vault-Tec's creations. Its systems remained functional for centuries, its life support pods never failing, its inhabitants preserved long after most vaults had decayed. Yet its success was its horror. Other vaults crumbled under their own dysfunctions, releasing their populations into the wasteland. Vault 112 never did. Instead, its people remained trapped, unchanging, preserved for Braun's endless experiments. The outside world might never have known the truth had it not been for a wandering vault dweller known as the Lone Wanderer. Searching for their father, James, the Wanderer discovered Vault 112 decades after the war. James had entered the simulation, drawn by Braun's knowledge, hoping to coax the scientist into aiding his project to purify the wasteland's water. But Braun, drunk on power, refused to cooperate. When the Lone Wanderer entered the simulation, they too became a pawn in Braun's twisted game. Within Tranquility Lane, the Wanderer saw firsthand the facade of suburban bliss and the cruelty lurking beneath. The simulated residents, cheerful on the surface, were broken inside, conditioned by Braun's endless torments. Betty, the child form of Braun, presented the Wanderer with a choice: to participate in one of his sadistic games, or to resist him. The tasks he set were chilling. He demanded the Wanderer manipulate, deceive, and ultimately destroy the lives of the residents. It was a test, not of skill, but of morality, echoing the cruel manipulations Vault-Tec had built into its experiments across the country. But, unlike the helpless residents, the Wanderer had agency. They could obey Braun, indulging his sadism and completing the tasks he demanded, or they could seek another way. Hidden within the simulation was a device, the Chinese invasion program, a countermeasure designed as a fail-safe to disrupt Braun's control. By activating it, the Wanderer could trigger an artificial invasion, breaking the illusion of Tranquility Lane. Soldiers storm the streets, shattering the peace, and the residents, for a brief moment, glimpse the truth of their captivity. With the fail-safe activated, the simulation was broken, and the Wanderer escaped. For Braun, however, there was no escape. His body remained locked in its pod, his mind trapped in the simulation. The fail-safe ensured that he could never leave, condemning him to an eternity within his own creation. His punishment was fitting, a prison of his own design, forever alone in the world he had twisted into a nightmare. For the residents, there was no salvation. Their bodies, sustained for generations, had withered beyond saving. Even freed from Braun's immediate torment, their lives had been stolen by the endless years within Tranquility Lane. Vault 112's story is a chilling reminder of how unchecked power corrupts. It shows the dangers not of scarcity or survival, but of control, of one individual wielding total authority over others. Where Vault 11 tested a community's morality under threat of annihilation, Vault 112 erased morality altogether, replacing it with the will of one man. The experiment was not about humanity's potential, but about its subjugation. What makes Vault 112 so haunting is the contrast between its setting and its reality. The picturesque neighborhood, with its smiling families and perfect homes, stands as a grotesque parody of pre-war America's ideals. It is the dream of suburban perfection twisted into a nightmare of obedience and cruelty. Beneath the white picket fences and the laughter of children lies a world of suffering, proving that even paradise can be a prison when freedom is taken away. Braun's legacy is not one of innovation, but of exploitation. He exemplifies the worst of Vault-Tec's philosophy, that people are tools, that their lives are expendable, that suffering is acceptable in the name of experiment. His work did not save humanity, it enslaved it. Vault 112 was never meant to be a sanctuary, and under his guidance, it became a warning of how easily technology, when placed in the wrong hands, can be turned into an instrument of terror. Today, Vault 112 stands as one of the strangest relics of the old world. Its systems may still hum, its pods still function, and its simulation may still run, but it is a place of ghosts. Those who enter its halls find not survivors, but prisoners, their bodies entombed in pods, their minds wandering through endless falsehoods. It is a vault that succeeded in preserving its population, but at the cost of their humanity. It is a vault that outlasted many others, but only as a monument to one man's cruelty. In the broader tapestry of Vault-Tec's experiments, Vault 112 is unique. It did not test survival, it did not test social cohesion, it did not even test morality. It tested submission, reducing its residents to playthings for the amusement of a single overseer. And in doing so, it revealed one of the darkest truths of Vault-Tec's vision, that the greatest danger was not the bombs, not the radiation, not the wasteland outside, but the corruption of power within. For those who hear the story of Vault 112, the lesson is clear. Comfort can be a prison, safety can be a lie, and paradise, when controlled by others, can become hell. The smiling faces of Tranquility Lane may look idyllic, but behind them lies a reality more terrifying than any mutant or raider. It is the reminder that freedom, no matter how harsh its reality, is worth more than the most beautiful illusion. And it is the proof that sometimes the worst monsters in the wasteland are not born of radiation or war, but of human ambition and cruelty left unchecked. Vault 75 was unlike most other vaults in its design and purpose. Where Vault 11 tore its residents apart with false democracy, and Vault 112 trapped its people in a simulated nightmare, Vault 75 was constructed under the guise of education and protection. Hidden beneath the halls of Malden Middle School in the Commonwealth, its entrance was disguised as a routine fallout shelter for students. To parents and children fleeing the bombs on that terrible day, it must have seemed like salvation. A refuge built right into the very school where their children studied, a place that promised to shield them from the destruction above. Yet, like all Vault-Tec facilities, the truth was darker, and in this case, it was a betrayal of the most vulnerable. Vault 75's experiment was centered on children, stripping them of their families, their freedom, and their futures. When the bombs fell, parents rushed their children into the vault, believing they were securing their safety. But upon sealing, the adults were separated from their offspring. The parents were executed almost immediately, gunned down under the justification that the vault did not have the resources to support them. To Vault-Tec, they were unnecessary baggage. The true focus was the children. From that moment onward, the vault became both orphanage and laboratory. The young were raised within its walls, not as survivors to inherit the world, but as test subjects for a program of genetic enhancement and social engineering. The stated purpose of Vault 75 was to improve humanity. The overseers and scientists presented themselves as caretakers, but their mission was to cultivate a generation of stronger, smarter, more resilient children. Through strict regimens of education, physical training, and medical experimentation, they sought to produce a human stock that could endure the post-apocalyptic wasteland and eventually rebuild society. On the surface, it may have seemed almost noble, but the reality was cruel. The children were not given choices. They were raised in a controlled environment where every aspect of their lives was dictated: what they ate, how they trained, even the careers they were forced into. They were not free, they were subjects. As the children grew, they were divided and assessed through rigorous testing. Those who excelled academically were pushed into scientific or administrative tracks. Those who demonstrated physical prowess were channeled into military training. The rest, those who failed to meet the standards, were quietly removed. Officially, they graduated from the program. In truth, they were executed, considered unworthy of resources, their existence deemed a failure in the experiment. Only the strong and the gifted were allowed to continue, their numbers carefully curated by the Vault's overseers. Medical experimentation was at the core of Vault 75's program. Children were subjected to genetic modification, hormone treatments, and a wide range of tests designed to push their bodies and minds beyond natural limits. They were monitored constantly, their growth recorded, their health scrutinized, their potential measured against Vault-Tec's impossible standards. For the scientists, these children were raw material, a means to an end. For the children themselves, it was a life of constant pressure, fear, and loss. They lived with the knowledge that failure meant death, and success meant deeper entanglement in a system that cared nothing for them as individuals. The overseer maintained control with cold efficiency. Authority was absolute, discipline was harsh, and resistance was crushed. The children, robbed of their parents and stripped of any sense of heritage, had no one to rely on but each other, yet even these bonds were poisoned by competition. Vault 75 pitted them against one another, turning friendship into rivalry, cooperation into suspicion. Each child knew that only the best would survive, and in such an environment, loyalty was fragile at best. It was a system designed not to nurture community, but to breed compliance. What made Vault 75 particularly insidious was its disguise. On the surface, the Vault looked like a place of learning. Classrooms, training halls, and laboratories gave it the appearance of a specialized academy. The children were told they were special, that they were the future of humanity. They were taught to be proud of their role, to believe they were chosen to lead the world's rebirth. But behind that veneer was cruelty. Pride was a mask for exploitation, and the education they received was a tool to mold them into instruments of Vault-Tec's will. Over the decades, the cycle repeated. New generations were raised, tested, and sorted. Some were pushed into positions of authority within the vault itself, taking on the roles of scientists and administrators once they reached adulthood. Others became soldiers, conditioned to obey, their strength harvested for Vault-Tec's ambitions, and always the failures were purged, erased quietly, their absence unacknowledged. The Vault sustained itself as a closed system, a machine that consumed childhood and produced obedience. But Vault-75, like so many of Vault-Tec's experiments, was not eternal. Over time, the system began to fracture. Resources dwindled, morale decayed. Even the most obedient subjects eventually questioned the system when confronted with its hypocrisy and brutality. Records indicate that uprisings occurred, small rebellions from those who had glimpsed the truth. Yet the Vault's overseers crushed these insurrections with ruthless precision, ensuring that no resistance could destabilize the experiment. Still, the cracks widened. By the time scavengers and survivors of the wasteland eventually discovered Vault-75, it was a ruin. The experiment had collapsed, the once ordered halls reduced to violence and decay. Raiders eventually overran the vault, stripping it of resources, leaving only remnants of its dark past. Terminals scattered throughout its chambers revealed the truth of its history, the execution of parents, the culling of children, the endless cycle of manipulation. To outsiders, it was a chamber of horrors, a place that turned innocence into ash. Vault-75's legacy is one of betrayal. It represents one of Vault-Tec's cruelest deceptions, hiding its true nature behind the familiar comfort of a school. Parents who thought they were saving their children instead delivered them into the hands of their executioners. Children who thought they were being prepared for greatness were reduced to test subjects, their lives measured only in terms of utility. And all of it was carried out under the guise of progress, the false promise that sacrifice would serve the greater good. In the broader story of the Vault experiments, Vault-75 exemplifies the corruption of ideals. Education, growth, and improvement are, in themselves, noble goals. But when twisted by authoritarian control and stripped of compassion, they become tools of oppression. Vault-Tec did not seek to nurture humanity's potential. It sought to shape it according to its own design, no matter how many lives were destroyed in the process. Vault-75 is a reminder that progress without ethics is cruelty disguised as science. For those who uncover its ruins in the Commonwealth, the sight is chilling. Classrooms filled with dust, laboratories abandoned, records left behind like tombstones to the lives they catalogued. The echoes of children's laughter, once heard in the halls, are gone, replaced by silence. The vault is a grave, not just for those who died within, but for the dreams of what it might have been had it truly served its intended purpose. Instead of protecting a generation, it consumed one. Instead of raising leaders, it created victims. Instead of saving humanity, it betrayed it. Vault-75's story stands alongside the tragedies of Vault-11 and Vault-112 as proof of Vault-Tec's philosophy that human life was secondary to experimentation, that no cruelty was too great in the pursuit of data. Its halls remind us that the most vulnerable children were not spared from this cruelty. They were targeted precisely because they were malleable, because their innocence could be twisted into obedience, because their futures could be written by those who claimed the right to control them. It is a story that lingers long after the vault itself has fallen silent, a testament to how far humanity can fall when compassion is replaced with ambition. When the bombs fell, and the world above was consumed in nuclear fire, Vault-106 sealed its doors like so many others, promising safety and survival to the people within. But Vault-Tec had designed something different for this community. The vault was stocked with psychoactive drugs, and not in small doses. Just 2 weeks after the vault door closed, automated systems released clouds of hallucinogenic gas into the air circulation system. The residents had no warning, no explanation, and no escape. From that moment on, Vault 106 was no longer a shelter. It was a laboratory of the mind. The experiment was simple in concept but devastating in practice. Expose an entire population to constant hallucinogens and observe how long they could function before the vault descended into chaos. The results, as one might expect, were catastrophic. At first, the inhabitants tried to continue with daily life. They gathered in the common rooms, prepared meals, and tended to their families. But the hallucinations soon began. Some saw flickers of movement in the corners of their eyes. Others heard voices whispering from behind the walls. Faces became distorted, words slurred into nonsense, and reality itself bent under the influence of the drugs. At first, people dismissed these visions as stress, as tricks of the mind brought on by confinement. But as the days turned into weeks, the truth became undeniable. The entire vault was poisoned by its own air. The residents responded with fear, suspicion, and eventually violence. Neighbors accused one another of sabotage. Convinced that the hallucinations were caused by enemies within the vault, families turned inward, barricading themselves in their quarters, desperate to escape the madness that seemed to grow worse each day. Overseer directives were ignored or misinterpreted, as even authority figures could not escape the haze of hallucination. In time, order broke down completely. The vault became a nightmare of flickering lights, echoing laughter, and distorted shadows that seemed to dance across the walls. Generations later, when wanderers from the capital wasteland stumbled into Vault 106, the gas was still being released. The automated systems had never stopped. Inside, the halls were dark, the walls coated in grime, and the residents long dead. And yet, there were still figures moving in the gloom, not survivors in the traditional sense, but twisted remnants of the vault's population, humans whose bodies had withstood decades of exposure to the gas, but whose minds were shattered beyond repair. They attacked intruders on sight, their eyes wild, their speech incoherent, driven by decades of drug-induced madness. Explorers who entered Vault 106 described it as walking into a waking dream. The hallways seemed to twist and shift. Familiar faces from the outside world appeared for a moment, only to dissolve into nothingness. Rooms changed shape, colors shifted, and the line between reality and hallucination blurred. Even those not exposed for long reported visions, as though the vault itself carried a memory of madness that seeped into every corner. Vault 106 stands out among Vault-Tec's experiments because it reveals just how little the company cared for its subjects. Unlike other vaults, where experiments at least had some basis in social engineering or long-term survival studies, Vault 106 offered no possible benefit. It was not designed to test leadership structures or communal bonds. It was not created to push scientific boundaries in medicine or technology. It was designed simply to see what would happen when people were driven insane. It was cruelty for the sake of data, suffering for the sake of observation. The fate of Vault 106 also raises haunting questions about intent. The gas release was scheduled for just 2 weeks after the vault was sealed. Why so soon? Did Vault-Tec believe that humanity had no future, and so their only purpose was to be experimented on immediately? Or did they simply find it efficient to begin their tests before resistance could build? Whatever the reason, the decision ensured that Vault 106 would never even begin to function as a community. It was doomed from the start. Today, the vault remains one of the most unsettling ruins in the capital wasteland. Explorers who dare to enter must battle not only the deranged inhabitants who remain, but also the vault itself. Lights flicker in hypnotic patterns, shadows dance in ways that defy explanation, and whispers seem to rise from the walls. Some say that the vault is haunted by the echoes of its former residents, their minds still trapped in endless hallucinations. Others argue that it is simply the lingering effect of the gas, warping the perceptions of anyone who breathes it in. But whatever the explanation, the effect is the same. Vault 106 feels alive, as though the experiment continues even long after its victims are gone. In the larger story of Vault-Tec, Vault 106 is a grim reminder of just how far the corporation was willing to go in the pursuit of knowledge. It was not enough to test obedience, or morality, or technological innovation. They also sought to explore madness itself, to pry open the human mind and see what happened when it was broken beyond repair. The result was not enlightenment, but tragedy. A community destroyed, lives wasted, and a vault that became a tomb of hallucinations. The lesson of Vault 106 is not about resilience or survival. It is about the fragility of the human mind and the cruelty of those who would exploit it. In the end, the only legacy of this vault is the madness it left behind, still echoing through its halls, still waiting for the next unfortunate soul who dares to open its doors. Vault 108 is one of the strangest vaults ever constructed by Vault-Tec. Compared to the tragedy of Vault 11, the cruelty of Vault 112, or the biological disaster of Vault 22, its story is at once absurd, haunting, and chilling. Hidden beneath the ruins of the capital wasteland, Vault 108's experiment revolved around cloning, the replication of human beings, and the consequences of creating life stripped of individuality. What began as a scientific pursuit ended in chaos, leaving behind a vault populated not by a community of survivors, but by an army of near-identical men, each bearing the same name, the same face, and the same eerie cry, "Gary!" The vault was equipped with a cloning lab, one of the few such facilities in the Vault-Tec network. Its stated purpose, at least on the surface, was to research human duplication as a means of ensuring continuity of population. In the harsh aftermath of nuclear war, Vault-Tec theorized that humanity might face catastrophic population loss. Cloning, they believed, could provide a solution, allowing communities to reproduce quickly and maintain genetic diversity. But as with all their experiments, the fine print revealed ulterior motives. Vault 108 was not about preservation, it was about control, manipulation, and the testing of what would happen if individuality itself was erased. From the moment the vault sealed, its residents were marked for failure. The overseer, nominally in charge, was terminally ill with cancer. His condition was known in advance, yet Vault-Tec selected him deliberately. His death was inevitable, and it was designed to create a power vacuum, stripping the vault of stable leadership early in its existence. Without guidance, the community fractured. Leadership disputes, uncertainty, and mistrust left the population vulnerable, and into that void stepped the cloning program. The first Gary clones were created not long after the overseer's death. At first, they appeared identical to ordinary humans. Their physical traits were normal, their health stable, and their behavior initially docile. But something went wrong. Whether by design or accident, the clones developed a disturbing trait. They could say only one word, Gary. They repeated it endlessly, sometimes in amusement, sometimes in aggression, sometimes in tones that suggested laughter or menace. Communication beyond that single word was impossible. They were incapable of expressing thoughts, memories, or individuality. They were, in essence, hollow shells of humanity, defined only by their shared name. At first, The residents may have treated them as curiosities, oddities produced by a flawed system. But soon, the Garies became more than curiosities. They became violent. For reasons never fully understood, perhaps due to psychological defects, or perhaps because Vault-Tec designed them to be this way, the clones began attacking the original inhabitants. The aggression escalated quickly. Groups of Garies would ambush individuals, overwhelming them with sheer numbers. Their eerie cries of Gary echoed through the halls as they descended upon their victims. Slowly, methodically, they eliminated the Vault's original residents, replacing them with endless versions of themselves. The process was relentless. Each time the cloning lab produced a new Gary, he joined the others, further tipping the balance of power. The original humans dwindled, while the Garies multiplied. Within a generation, Vault 108 belonged entirely to them. The hallways once meant to house families and scientists became the stomping grounds of identical clones, wandering aimlessly, giggling, growling, and muttering their single word. Gary became both greeting and battle cry, an echo that filled the Vault's empty chambers. What makes Vault 108 so unnerving is the loss of identity it represents. Humanity is built upon individuality, names, memories, personalities, differences that shape who we are. The Garies had none of this. They were identical in body, nearly identical in mind, stripped of history, stripped of culture, stripped even of language. To encounter them was to face a mockery of humanity, a reflection of what happens when science reduces life to replication without soul. They were not people. They were echoes, shadows of the man they were cloned from, repeating his name like a mantra, but devoid of everything that made him human. In time, the Garies became the sole occupants of Vault 108. They wandered its hallways, loitered in its chambers, and guarded its secrets. Their behavior was unpredictable, sometimes curious, sometimes playful, but more often hostile. Intruders were met with sudden aggression, swarms of Garies attacking in unison, their cries echoing like a chorus of madness. To an outsider, the Vault was a nightmare, not of radiation or mutation, but of endless repetition. The fate of the original Gary, the man from whom the clones were derived, remains uncertain. Some believe he was one of the Vault's residents, selected for his genetic stability. Others suggest he may have been a scientist, one of the very people running the experiment, unknowingly or knowingly sacrificed to his own creation. Whoever he was, his identity was erased, consumed by the multitude of copies that bore only his name. His legacy is not one of achievement, but of distortion, an endless army of Garies who outlived him, replacing his humanity with their grotesque parody. The story of Vault 108 is both comical and terrifying. On the surface, the image of dozens of identical men shouting, "Gary," might inspire laughter. But beneath the absurdity is something deeply unsettling. The Garies are not simply clones. They are proof of how fragile identity is, how easily individuality can be stripped away when people are reduced to biological templates. They are reminders that humanity is not just flesh and bone, but memory, thought, and soul. Remove those, and what remains is little more than an echo. Vault 108's experiment reveals yet another facet of Vault-Tec's philosophy. It was not enough for them to test morality, obedience, or survival. They also sought to test identity itself, to see what would happen when individuality was erased, when an entire population was reduced to a single repeated copy. The result was chaos, violence, and the annihilation of the very concept of community. For a community requires difference, different skills, different perspectives, different voices. In Vault 108, there was only one voice, repeating one word, until the vault became a chorus of madness. For those who later discovered the vault, the experience was surreal. Travelers exploring the capital wasteland would stumble upon its chambers and encounter the Garys. The clones attacked with their usual cry, each one seemingly identical to the last, each one convinced of his own singular existence even as he mirrored the others. To fight them was to face the same man again and again, as though time itself had looped, trapping the wanderer in an endless cycle of repetition. It was a battle not just against enemies, but against the loss of meaning itself. In the end, Vault 108 stands as a monument to both science and folly. It demonstrates the incredible potential of human technology, the ability to replicate life itself, but it also shows the emptiness of such potential when stripped of purpose, compassion, and wisdom. Cloning could have been a tool to preserve humanity, to ensure survival after the bombs. Instead, it became a weapon that erased humanity, replacing it with hollow copies of a man whose only legacy was his name. Today, the vault remains, inhabited by its endless Garys, a place frozen in time. The experiment did not collapse like Vault 75, nor was it consumed like Vault 22. It continues, in its own strange way, as the Garys roam their halls, oblivious to the world outside, trapped in their eternal chorus. It is one of the few vaults where the experiment persists long after its intended end, not because it succeeded, but because it created something self-sustaining, something bizarrely eternal. The story of Vault 108 reminds us of the dangers of reducing life to its bare mechanics. Humanity cannot be copied like a document, or cloned like a cell, without losing something essential. The Garys are proof of this. Living, breathing, fighting, and yet utterly empty. They are both tragedy and farce, horror and comedy, a grotesque mirror held up to the very idea of what it means to be human. And they are a final, fitting testament to Vault-Tec's obsession with experimentation, no matter the cost, no matter how absurd, no matter how monstrous the outcome. The story of Vault-Tec is not just the story of a corporation. It is the story of humanity's greatest fears, its greatest ambitions, and its darkest impulses, all condensed into a network of steel doors and subterranean chambers. From its rise in the decades before the Great War to the legacy it left scattered across the wasteland, Vault-Tec shaped not only the survival of the human race, but also its suffering. The company promised salvation, a future where families could survive the end of the world. Instead, it offered experiments, cruelty, and manipulation, all hidden behind the reassuring glow of a smiling logo. When the bombs fell, the vaults became more than shelters. They became laboratories. Each vault was designed to test something different: isolation, obedience, the limits of science, the corruption of morality. Some vaults were stocked with unstable populations, carefully chosen to ignite conflict. Others introduced mind-altering substances, enforced authoritarian control, or experimented with technology decades ahead of its time. The stated purpose was always survival. The real purpose was always control. Vault-Tec believed that in the ruins of civilization, a new humanity could be forged through suffering. By placing men, women, and children into impossible situations, the company sought to observe, to record, and to manipulate. Would they fight? Would they comply? Would they lose their humanity or cling to it despite everything? These questions were not academic. They were treated as data, as variables in an experiment whose outcome could shape the future. But the vaults also revealed the arrogance of their designers. In their pursuit of knowledge, they ignored the cost to human life. They believed that human beings could be stripped of freedom, individuality, and morality, and still serve as useful subjects. In many cases, the results were catastrophic. Vaults collapsed, populations were destroyed, and communities that might have thrived were reduced to madness or death, the company's hubris was matched only by its cruelty. And yet, not every vault was a failure. Some succeeded beyond expectation. Vault 8, for instance, gave rise to Vault City, a functioning society that survived long after the bombs, even if it carried with it the arrogance and elitism of its origin. Other vaults, such as Vault 13, produced wanderers and leaders whose actions would shape the future of entire regions. Even the vaults designed to fail sometimes birthed resilience, as survivors emerged into the wasteland hardened by what they endured. In this way, Vault-Tec became not just an agent of cruelty, but also an unintended catalyst for change. The legacy of Vault-Tec is visible across the wasteland. In the east, the capital wasteland is haunted by the Gary clones of Vault 108, the frozen families of Vault 112's virtual world, and the sealed community of Vault 101. In the west, the Mojave bears the scars of Vault 22's failed botanical experiments and the brutal training of Vault 34's overstocked armories. The Commonwealth is marked by the tragedy of Vault 111, where families were promised safety but given only cryogenic stasis and loss. And everywhere, in every corner of post-war America, the symbol of Vault-Tec is a reminder of a promise broken, a hope betrayed. But what makes Vault-Tec's story so powerful is not just its cruelty, it is what it reveals about humanity. In each vault, in every twisted experiment, we see reflections of our own fears and failings. In Vault 11, people were asked to sacrifice one of their own to survive. In Vault 87, human bodies were twisted into monsters in the pursuit of evolution. In Vault 95, the grip of addiction was exploited to measure despair. These are not just experiments. They are mirrors, showing us the worst of what we can become when fear, power, and desperation strip away compassion. And yet, in the ruins of these experiments, humanity endured. The lone wanderer emerged from Vault 101, defying the sealed walls of their prison. The sole survivor stepped out of Vault 111, carrying the grief of a stolen family, but determined to find meaning in a broken world. The courier, in the Mojave, crossed the wastes influenced by the stories of vaults both failed and successful. Each vault that destroyed lives also created survivors who carried those lessons into the wider world. In this way, Vault-Tec's legacy is both tragedy and resilience, cruelty and strength. Perhaps the most haunting truth is that Vault-Tec never saw themselves as villains. To the scientists and executives, they were visionaries. They believed that by pushing humanity to its limits, they could prepare it for the future. They saw their experiments as necessary sacrifices, their subjects as data points in a grand design. They wrapped cruelty in the language of science, exploitation in the guise of progress. In their own eyes, they were saving humanity. It is this certainty, this conviction that they were right, that makes their story all the more chilling. What remains of Vault-Tec is scattered and broken. Its executives are long dead, its laboratories abandoned, its vaults in ruins, but its influence lingers. Every wanderer who enters a vault carries with them the weight of its history. Every settlement that encounters the survivors of a vault inherits the legacy of its experiment. In this way, Vault-Tec lives on, not as a corporation, but as a cautionary tale etched into the bones of the wasteland. The vaults were meant to be havens, but they became tombs. They were meant to preserve, but they destroyed. They were meant to safeguard the future, but they warped it beyond recognition. And yet, from the ashes of their failure, a new world emerged. A harsher world, a scarred world, but one that still carried the spark of humanity. In the end, that spark may be the greatest experiment of all, not one designed by Vault-Tec, but one that arose in spite of them. As we walk through the ruins of their legacy, we are left with questions that still haunt us. Was Vault-Tec a vision of the future, or a warning of what happens when ambition eclipses morality? Were the vaults a path to salvation, or a descent into madness? And perhaps most chilling of all, if given the same power, the same fear, the same desperation, would we have done differently? Vault-Tec is gone. Its experiments are finished, but its story remains, echoing in the dark halls of abandoned vaults, whispered in the cries of survivors, etched into the landscape of the wasteland. It is a story of promises broken, of cruelty masked as science, of humanity tested and twisted. And it is a story that will endure as long as the vaults themselves, sealed monuments to both the folly of the past and the resilience of those who survived it. In the end, Vault-Tec's true legacy is not the vaults, not the experiments, not even the suffering they caused. It is the resilience of those who endured. For every community destroyed, another rose from its ashes. For every experiment that sought to erase humanity, survivors carried it forward into the future. That resilience, that refusal to be broken, is what defines humanity. Not Vault-Tec's cruelty, but humanity's endurance. And so, the vaults stand silent now, scattered across the wasteland, their steel doors rusting, their experiments long concluded. Some hold only echoes, others still harbor the twisted results of their designs. But all of them remind us of the price of fear, the danger of unchecked ambition, and the strength it takes to endure both. This is the legacy of Vault-Tec. This is the story of humanity tested in fire, broken by cruelty, and yet somehow still unbroken.